Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jair Suarez, and I would like to welcome everyone to our session. It is my great honor to introduce our speaker. We got a very special speaker with a lot of knowledge, related to the topic today. And this is Dr. Ruth Shem from University of California at Davis, where she is a Luke and Grace Kim Professor in Cultural Psychiatry. She's also a Professor of Clinical Psychiatry, Director of Cultural Psychiatry, and Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusive Education at UC Davis School of Medicine. She's a member of the Board of Trustees for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the American Association for Community Psychiatry. She serves on the Research and Evaluation Committee of the California Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission. She is also on the editorial boards for JAMA Psychiatry, Psychiatric Services, Community Mental Health Journal, and American Psychiatric Publishing, and is also the co-editor of the books, The Social Determinants of Mental Health and Social Injustice in Mental Health. Today's session will explore social influences and inequities in health. Dr. Shem will share some of her insights from her recent book, which is called Social Injustice and Mental Health. So if you'd please join me in welcoming Dr. Shem.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's really great to be here with you all in beautiful Puerto Rico on the last day of this conference. So it's been wonderful for me in my inaugural ACNP meeting to be here with all of you. So whenever I give a talk about social injustice and when we focus on race and racism and issues related to equity, I always have to preface the talk. And the talk, we always preface our talk by giving our disclosure statement, and I actually don't have anything to disclose. But I do have to make a number of disclaimers before we continue. And the first major disclaimer that I have to make is that these are difficult and uncomfortable topics. And so when we talk about these issues, a lot of times we have these feelings that come up in us. And so while I'm talking about these topics, I think sometimes people will feel certain things like guilt, anger, resentment, maybe even defensiveness. Sometimes when I give talks, people perceive me as accusing them of being racist or sexist or any other number of terrible things. And a lot of times when I give talks about these topics, people think that perhaps I have some sort of specific political agenda that I'm advancing, which actually may or may not be true, but also that I lack objectivity and that my work is not really based in any type of scientific thought. And these are all things that you might feel as we talk about these issues. And one of the reasons why you might feel all of these things is because we have been socialized as a society to think that it is not polite to talk about issues like racism and injustice and oppression. And as scientists, we have not really been taught about the connection between oppression and injustice in health. But another reason why it's so hard to talk about this is following the death of George Floyd last year, many of us felt that society fundamentally shifted. And much of the discussion was around the idea that we were in this moment of racial reckoning, that all of a sudden we finally, collectively as a society, understood that racism is a terrible thing. And it would be great if we had that racial reckoning as a society, but unfortunately, we're starting to understand that that racial reckoning maybe did not happen. And this is data from the New York Times that shows that white people are less supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement than they were at the beginning of 2020. So prior to the death of George Floyd, we saw that there were more white people in support of Black Lives Matter than we have in current day times. And so that racial reckoning that we all hoped would happen and the encouraged feelings that we had when we were protesting in the streets, that has pretty much all but disappeared, as these things tend to do, which makes it hard to focus in on these topics. So I always call on the wisdom of of James Baldwin when talking about these issues and trying to move through the difficultness of these topics. And so I want to highlight something that he said. He said that I'm not interested in anybody's guilt. Guilt is a luxury we can no longer afford. I know you didn't do it, and I didn't do it either, but I am responsible for it because I am a man and a citizen of this country, and you are responsible for it for the very same reason. So with that, I've made my disclaimer, and I think we can launch into the material we're going to talk about today. So we're talking about social injustice and its relationship to mental health. And one of the things that, I have to kind of describe is that social justice itself as a term has a pretty controversial history. There's negative connotations associated with the concepts of social justice. And just as an example of that, a physician by the name of Stanley Goldfarb in 2019 published an article in the Wall Street Journal that he titled, "Take 2 Aspirin and Call Me by My Pronouns." He said he was extremely concerned at the ways that social justice was infecting medical education. The idea that we were thinking too much and focusing too much on issues of social justice instead of teaching medical students how to be good doctors. And one of the quotes from his article was, "Why have medical schools become a target for inculcating social policy when the stated purpose of medical education since Hippocrates has been to develop individuals who know how to cure patients?" And he also said, "Curricula will increasingly focus on climate change, social inequities, gun violence, bias, and other progressive causes only tangentially related to treating illness, and so will many of your doctors in coming years." So he really sounded the alarm. He was very concerned about this. And several of his colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania also published a response to this op-ed that appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. They said that social and health policies have always determined who gets sick and who gets care, and where and how. Understanding the social drivers of health and illness is not peripheral or tangential to health. It is the key to diagnosing and meeting a patient's fundamental needs. So I think that this debate around the importance of social justice and if we need to focus on social justice is one that rages within science. And so it's important that we actually define the concept, what social justice actually is. And so it is, in fact, at its base, a philosophical term. And so one philosopher, David Miller, defined social justice as the distribution of good or advantages or bad and disadvantages in society, and more specifically, how these things should be distributed in society. So he said that it was concerned with the ways that these resources are allocated to people by social institutions. And then another philosopher, John Rawls, said that social justice is assuring the protection of equal access to liberties, rights, and opportunities, as well as taking care of the least advantaged members of society. Now, when we talk about mental health, this becomes critical, because people with mental illnesses and people who suffer from substance use disorders, these are, in fact, have become, by virtue of a number of things that I will talk about further, have become the least advantaged members of our society. And so how then we as a society make a decision about how we're going to choose to care for this population becomes a critical existential question of our time. So related to that, another important thing we have to talk about is the intersection of race and racism when we talk about these topics. And so there are a couple of challenges in thinking about race and racism and how it relates to these things. The first and foremost is that race is a social and political construct. And this is a very difficult to understand term. What we mean by that is that race was something that was constructed, that was built, that was categorized and created for the purposes of advancing social agendas and for the purpose of advancing certain policies and certain political structures. So the idea of in creating a hierarchy and enforcing that hierarchy was something that the concept of race was created in order to do. And what we know about that is that race cannot be accurately or genetically or biologically categorized. So we cannot draw somebody's blood and determine what their race is. We cannot run a genetic test on someone and determine what their race is, as much as many people believe that they can and as much as many people try. What we do know is that race is a very rough and imprecise proxy for a number of other things, and that includes culture, genetics, socioeconomic status, and many other factors. And yet, even though we know that it is this rough and imprecise proxy, we still use race to confirm a number of assumptions, prejudices, and biases about ourselves, about our patients, about the people that we serve. I think it's really important here to stop and say that even though I'm saying that race is a social and a political construct and that it was a created idea, it doesn't mean that race doesn't have massive significance or importance. And part of the reason that it has such important significance is because how salient the ways in which we have used race to confirm these assumptions and prejudices and biases have become sweeping in the impact on people. So race, although it is socially and politically constructed, is extremely important. And so why we need to think about that in a very thoughtful way becomes very critical. So a couple of things to clarify. And again, I think it's almost hilarious that I have to say these types of things to scientists who are very knowledgeable, some of the most intelligent people who still don't really understand these concepts completely. But it is important to state that there is no genetic basis for race. And so what we know by the sequencing of the human genome is that 99.99% of genes are shared by all humans, and that variation only exists in 0.01% of the human genome. And of that 0.01% variation, the proportion of the total diversity in the human genome is about 87% within populations, or within these groups that we kind of consider to be racial groups. So that variation is actually happening within those groups as opposed to across those groups. At about 9% of that 0.01 variation is between populations within regions, and about 4% is within regions alone. So when we look at this tiny bit of genetic diversity that we have kind of connected so closely to the idea of race, it is the even most tiniest part of that tiniest part that actually has anything to do specifically with race. What people do conflate a lot of times with race when they think about these issues is this concept of genetic ancestry, which involves sharing a genetic line of descent. So some population groups are more likely to carry certain alleles because of shared ancestry, and this may or may not be mapped onto certain regions of the world. And so a lot of times when we talk about race and we talk about the fact that there is no genetic or biological basis for race, many people will bring up the argument of sickle cell disease. And they'll say, well, sickle cell disease, that is a disease that specifically only affects people of certain racial and ethnic groups. And that is actually not accurate. So what we do know that particularly in the United States, sickle cell disease does tend to, because of the geographic composition of the United States, it does affect people with African ancestry more commonly. But if you look across the world, the 3 countries with the highest rates of newborns with sickle cell disease in the world are Nigeria, Congo, and India. So again, this is a misperception that there are racial conditions, that there are certain diseases that break according to racial groups, which is just not true. Okay, so I want us to contemplate this important quotation by Brenna Greer, who is a writer, and this is just something I want us to take a minute to think about. African Americans have higher incarceration rates, higher unemployment, lower incomes, lower home and business ownership, less education, less health care, more disease, and lower life expectancy than whites. If you believe blacks are naturally dumb, sick, criminal, you have your answer for these discrepancies. If, however, you resist using stereotypes to make sense of your world, institutional racism provides a very practical and very traceable explanation for the inferior societal position of African Americans. I think that the piece that's important to know with this particular quotation is that as scientists, many times, I think that we often default to thinking that maybe there is some type of natural predilection for certain racial groups that better explains the differences that we see in outcomes than the very traceable and very practical explanations that exist from structural and institutional racism. So a little historical background on how we got to this place. So this painting may be familiar to many of us. This is the signers of the Declaration of Independence. You see these gentlemen in the room gathered here, and of course this amazing credo that came out of the Declaration that says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What an incredible concept by which this country was founded. But I think it's really important to note here that the gentlemen that were in this room, when they talked about all men being created equal, first of all, they were specifically talking about men. And particularly, they were only talking about the men that appear in this room and the people like them. And I think that there was probably no irony to the point that they were probably not even conscious of the idea that they were excluding so many other people in this perception of society and this idea of who was entitled to pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. But they were really clear about this. They made these laws and the rules and policies that we founded this country on, specifically acknowledging and elevating the people in this room and the people like them. And then about 80 years later, you saw the rise of a physician by the name of Samuel Cartwright. And in his psychiatric thought, he described certain conditions associated with enslaved black people. He said that slaves had certain mental health problems associated with them. One of them he described as something called drapetomania. He said that this was the mental illness of an enslaved black person trying to escape captivity, trying to run away. The idea that trying to escape slavery is a mental illness seems very bizarre to us, but at the time it was something that was somewhat accepted. And his mindset, the way he described this condition, he said, if any one or more of them at any time are inclined to raise their heads to a level with their master or overseer, humanity in their own good requires that they should be punished until they fall into that submissive state which was intended for them to occupy. They have only to be kept in that state and treated like children to prevent and cure them from running away. And then he also described another condition which he referred to as dysesthesia ethiopica. He said that this disease is the natural offspring of Negro liberty, the liberty to be idle, to wallow in filth, to indulge in improper food and drinks. After the prescribed course of treatment, the slave will look grateful and thankful to the white man whose compulsory power has restored his sensation and dispelled the mist that clouded his intellect. When he was talking about dysesthesia ethiopica, he was basically describing this as a disease of rascality or the inherent laziness of enslaved black people. And there are a couple of things that are kind of striking about this. The idea that he coined this illness and said that black people are inherently lazy and didn't want to work hard, without any sort of context for the fact that enslaved black people were working at levels of productivity that were far beyond what normal human beings should be expected to work. And often they were working at those high levels of productivity with significant challenges, including nutritional deficits because they weren't being fed appropriate diets, and multiple physical and health conditions that were interfering with their ability to put out, and yet still they were working at these extremely high levels of productivity. And somehow the notion that there was this inordinate laziness took hold. And what I would say is that we can stop and say, oh, this happened 300 years ago. This is not who we are today. But the stereotype of a lazy black person is incredibly persistent and has persisted throughout our society and still exists to this day. And so these thoughts, these initial concepts by Cartwright are extremely powerful and pervasive, and they really have carried on much into the ways that we think about psychiatric thought to this day. I also just want to make another comment around the concerns of this physician describing these particular conditions, because one of the things that he said was that the treatment for both of these conditions was whipping. So I want to take a minute to just pivot a little bit and talk about two specific concepts, the concept of health disparities, and contrast that with the concept of health inequities. So health disparities are defined as differences in health status among distinct segments of the population, including differences that occur by gender, race or ethnicity, education or income, disability, or living in various geographic localities. And I want to contrast that with the definition of health inequities, which are disparities in health that are the result of systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices that create barriers to opportunity. And one of the things I think is so interesting about these two terms is that the health disparities term is the one we tend to use more often, and particularly folks in the United States tend to use the health disparities term more often. Folks in other countries tend to use the health inequities term more often. And it's not to say that that either definition is wrong or that one is more correct than the other, but I will say that one of the things that's important to know when we think about health inequities is that it specifically says what the cause of the problem is. It's saying that the reason that we see these differences in health outcomes are because of systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices. The health disparities definition does not specify why you see differences in health. And that's fine, but when we don't specifically specify those differences, we tend to revert to thinking about it as some sort of intrinsic difference between certain populations, that perhaps there's something intrinsically different between men and women that leads to these differences in health outcomes. Perhaps there's something intrinsically different, whether it be biologically or genetically different between different racial groups that explains these differences. Or perhaps it's something cultural. Perhaps certain groups have different cultural belief systems and they make different choices about their health, and that these are the reasons why we see these differences in health outcomes, rather than what really drives differences in health, which are systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices, and really is the result of almost all of the health differences that we see in our society. And I'll just point out throughout this talk, give several examples of how we tend to kind of constantly revert back to this thinking where we put the cause of these differences on the individual or on the different populations and kind of seat that pathology within the individual instead of thinking about those structural barriers or those social barriers, social and economic policies and practices that create those barriers. So we must define this concept, the social determinants of mental health, that I know you all are quite familiar with at this point. They are the societal, environmental, and economic conditions that impact and affect mental health outcomes across various populations. These conditions are shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at global, national, and local levels, which are themselves influenced by policy choices. And the social determinants of health are prominently responsible for both the health disparities and inequities that we see within and among populations. It's a fly. So how this relates to the work that I do. Several years back, my colleague Michael Compton and I set out to try and get all of the best evidence together that supports that the social determinants of mental health lead to poor outcomes in mental health and substance use. And we compiled that work into the book, The Social Determinants of Mental Health. And after much time and much thinking about these concepts, what I began to understand is that there is something underlying or driving the social determinants of mental health, and that is in fact social injustice in mental health. And so this is work that I did with my colleague Sarah Vinson to really get at the underlying concepts of how social injustice leads to the development of the social determinants of mental health, which then lead to these poor outcomes. And I'll walk you through that thought process of mine right now. So this somewhat complicated looking figure is our conceptualization, Michael Compton and I's conceptualization of the social determinants of mental health. At the very top, you see adverse mental health outcomes and mental health inequities. Each time you move down this figure, you see one more layer, you're moving one layer upstream. So one step down from adverse mental health outcomes and mental health inequities, we see a number of risk factors. And we know that risk factors precede an illness and increase the likelihood that we will develop illness. We spent a lot of time in neuropsychopharmacology research identifying risk factors, thinking that if we intervene at the level of the risk factor, we can prevent these negative mental health outcomes. But one of the things that I've come to understand is that if we're intervening at the level of the risk factor, we're intervening too late. Because basically, there is a number of content, a number of things that has happened that have shaped the development of those risk factors. So Link and Phelan call these the fundamental causes of disease. And so Sir Michael Marmot and Jeffrey Rose call these things the causes of the causes. So they are the social determinants of health or the social determinants of mental health, and they set the context for the development of the risk factor. So all of these things you see in these 4 boxes are social determinants of mental health that are the causes of the causes. They are things like adverse early life experiences, discrimination, low education and unemployment and poverty, housing and homelessness, food insecurity, transportation insecurity, poor access to health care, adverse features of the built environment, and pollution exposure and climate change. So all of those factors, and again, that's not an exhaustive list, but all of those factors, those social determinants, create the context by which the risk factor develops. And that risk factor then leads to these poor mental health outcomes and these mental health inequities. But again, as time has gone on, I've started to understand that if you are intervening at the level of the social determinant, you are still intervening too late. And the reason for that is because there are actually causes of the causes of the causes. There are underlying factors that set the context for the development of the social determinants of mental health. And those things are, in fact, social injustice. So unfair and unjust distribution of opportunity. And what's driving that unfair and unjust distribution of opportunity are 2 things. Social norms, or our ideas, our fundamental ideas about people in our society. Who is worthy of advantage, who is worthy of disadvantage, those concepts around social justice. So those social norms, our beliefs. And then our public policies, the laws that we pass that reflect that belief system. So basically, as a society, we have collectively decided who, much like the gentleman in the signers of the Declaration of Independence room, we have collectively decided who is worthy of advantage in our society, and we have passed laws that reflect those belief systems. And we've also decided who are the people that are less worthy, who are the people that deserve disadvantage in our society, and we have created laws that reflect that belief system as well. So just as an example, if we think about crack cocaine, and especially if we think about the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, much of the thought is driven by the media, driven by a lot of perspectives, is that black people tend to use crack cocaine. And we actually have very gendered beliefs about the type of people who use crack cocaine, the type of black people who use crack cocaine. So if it is a black man, he is probably dangerous, he's probably a criminal, he's probably violent. If it's a black woman, she's probably a terrible mother who doesn't care about her children and is really just focused on trying to get her next hit. And because we have these really negative beliefs, because these are the social norms we have about people who use crack cocaine, we as a society passed a number of public policies that reflect that belief system. And so chief among them in 1986 was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. This was the act that created a 100-to-1 jail sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And so what that means is that if you are caught with 1 gram of crack cocaine in your possession, you would receive the same jail sentence as somebody who had 100 grams of powder cocaine in their possession. So this law makes no sense. Clearly, mainly because these drugs are the same chemical compound. So these drugs are not particularly different. What is different are the people who use these drugs. So, or not even actually the people who use these drugs, but the people who are associated most with using these drugs. And so powder cocaine is most associated with rich white people, and crack cocaine is associated with poor black people. And so as a result of those social norms, we created a policy that basically said if you had enough crack cocaine in your possession just for your own use, so because you have a drug problem, you're using this particular amount of crack cocaine, you will have the same punishment as somebody who is intending to sell and distribute a drug. And so that policy was in effect for many years, and it really led to the mass incarceration of a number of black people. It also led to, it really intensified the war on drugs that we see. And the other thing that it did was it really criminalized the use of this particular drug. So people who maybe needed substance use treatment could not get that treatment because it was criminalized for them to even have this drug in their possession. And that was highlighted by Ernest Drucker in his book, A Plague of Prisons, when he said the fundamental clinical accountability of drug treatment professionals to individual patients has been subordinated to the goals of the criminal justice system. And you know, a lot of people, when I talk about this crack cocaine example, a lot of people say, well, you know, we're better than that now. We've gotten to a better place. We've learned from the opioid use epidemic. But one of the things that's important to know is that that Anti-Drug Abuse Act was in effect until 2010, at which case there was a strong push to eliminate that jail sentencing disparity. And the best that could be done was to minimize it to 18-1 instead of 100-1. And so now somebody gets the same drug sentence, the same jail sentence for 1 gram of crack cocaine as they do 18 grams of powder cocaine. There is legislation constantly up before Congress trying to eliminate this disparity, and it never goes anywhere. And I think that we need to think more about how we contrast this with the opioid epidemic and how we think about the type of people. What are our social norms about people who use opioids? It's actually very, very different from people who use crack cocaine. In fact, we don't consider opioid use to be a criminal justice problem. We consider it to be a public health crisis. We don't have criminal sentencing issues that really interfere with somebody seeking drug treatment, and we don't vilify people who use these drugs in the ways that we do. So our social norms about people who use opioids are very different, and they have led to different policies, which have led to different distribution of opportunity, which has led to differing social determinants for those populations. And the last thing I'll just say about crack cocaine and how these policies how the social norms around who uses crack cocaine leads to these laws that create unfair and unjust distribution of opportunity. That mass incarceration that we saw that picked up in the 1980s and has continued to this day has led to a number of social determinants of health. So once someone is arrested for having crack cocaine in their possession, when they get out of jail, it's almost impossible to get a job because of laws and policies that make it hard for people who have felony records to get jobs. If you don't have a job, it's very challenging from a poverty standpoint for you to have any sort of way to kind of contribute to society. If you're poor and you don't have a job, it's very likely you're not going to have a home. That's going to lead to housing challenges. It's definitely going to lead to food insecurity. If you don't have a job, you're not going to be able to access health care because we have health care tied to employment in this country. So you can see how this activates a host of social determinants of health, just this one policy and this one act. But worse than that, it actually has intergenerational effects, because we know that one of the adverse childhood experiences is having a parent who is incarcerated. So not only does it affect that person, but it actually affects the family members and the children, and it goes on to have sweeping effects on whole societies and whole populations. Okay, so I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about a couple of important concepts. So these are things that we tend to do in medicine and in science that can be very problematic when we think about social injustice. The first is this idea of essentialism, and this is, I think, something that neuropsychopharmacology research tends to do a lot. Essentialism is the belief that there are distinct, unchanging, and natural characteristics that define social groups and facilitate their categorization. This is the idea that we can put people into very clear categories based on their race, based on their ethnicity, based on their gender, based on their sexuality. And the actuality is that is absolutely not true. You cannot categorize people into boxes in the ways that we would like to. And when we conduct our research, we often think that we can in ways where we are trying to put people into boxes that they don't fit into cleanly. And then we draw conclusions based on those boxes that don't really make any sense. So the act of essentialism is problematic. Erasure of context, I already talked about in thinking about Samuel Cartwright, but this is when we do not consider the socio-historical context when seeking to understand the etiology of inequities. Biological determinism is the false belief that racial groups are biologically and genetically different. Again, I'm always shocked that I have to highlight that biological determinism is false because it is so persistent and so prevalent. And my number one example of that is the 2016 study by Hoffman and colleagues, which pointed out that a number of medical students had beliefs that there were biological differences between black and white people. A number of these medical students believed that black people have thicker skin than white people, that black people have fewer nerve endings than white people. And then cultural determinism is the false belief that differences in racial groups are primarily the result of cultural factors. And this is most commonly seen when we think about diet. And we say, oh, certain cultural groups eat certain foods, and those foods put them at risk for certain negative outcomes. That's not really what's driving those differences in outcomes, but we tend to put a lot of weight on those types of things. A couple of other concepts. These are different types of oppression. This is work by Iris Marion Young. One is exploitation, which is the unequal exchange of one group's labor and energies for another group's advantage and advancement. Clearly, when we think about slavery, that is a clear example of exploitation, but we have lots of examples of exploitation in our current society, including human trafficking, or even treatment of migrant farm workers or other populations that are mistreated in our society. Cultural imperialism is when we establish the ruling class culture as the norm and we other those groups that are not part of the dominant culture. Just another example of cultural imperialism that I find striking in looking at research. Whenever I look at odds ratios in a scientific article that's looking at racial differences, always, the reference group is always white people. And it does not matter, ever, how many people of what race is in that study. It is always the reference group. And that's this idea that the ruling class culture is the norm, and that every other group is the group by which we need to compare those groups to. Powerlessness is when oppressed groups lack power or they're blocked from routes to gaining power. Clearly, a modern-day example of this is voter suppression. It's ways for people not to be able to express or represent themselves in any type of setting. But we also see this again in research when we think about how we design research studies and we don't include the populations to give input on these studies. And this is why it's so crucial and important to do community-based participatory research. Marginalization is when we expel specific groups from meaningful participation in society. So clearly, mass incarceration is an example of this, but we have had policies throughout history that have done wonderful jobs marginalizing people, including the treatment of indigenous populations in the United States, things like the Japanese Exclusion Act. Violence are threats and experiences of physical and structural violence, and it really speaks for itself, but what I will just say is that structural violence is when harm is done by people who have power against people who have less power. And structural violence does not have to be physical violence, it just has to be any type of harm that is done. And so I'm going to define structural racism for everyone. It is a system, this is work by the Aspen Institute. It is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. This system identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. It is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist, and it does not require the actions or the intentions of others, meaning that if we got rid of all the interpersonal discrimination that exists in our society today, we would still see racial and ethnic inequities due to the persistence of structural racism, due to the fact that it is baked into our systems, our structures, and our policies. So a couple of examples of how structural racism impacts health and how we see it. I've already talked about the war on drugs, so I'm not going to repeat that, but I will talk about residential segregation. This, of course, is those policies that happened in the early 1900s, focusing on things like redlining, in which certain communities were devalued or disinvested in based on policies created by the federal government. So you found that communities of color had disinvestment in certain neighborhoods and certain areas, whereas white communities had investment in these neighborhoods and communities. And you still see, again, the effects of residential segregation to this day, because what you see is that certain communities have great and easy access to healthcare services, to treatment populations, and other communities have very little access to these things. A kind of clear example of residential segregation that we see currently in the middle of our pandemic is that there is really strong data to show that people that live in predominantly black communities have to travel significantly farther to get to the closest vaccination site than people who live in predominantly white communities. And so what that means is that if there is this structural barrier from residential segregation that makes it harder for people to get to the closest vaccination site, this is a massive reason why people don't get vaccinated at the same rates. Yet, we tend to really highlight this idea of vaccine hesitancy, and we say that certain racial and ethnic groups don't get the vaccinations because they are hesitant and they don't have a desire. And we don't look, again, we look much more at these intrinsic things rather than looking at the structural barriers. Immigration policy is very much like this because with our immigration policies, we have the capabilities to screen who comes into the country and who does not. We can say who gets to easy access to the United States. A perfect example of this is that we do not have a wall or any type of border between access to Canada and the United States, and yet you see extreme policy differences at the border of Mexico and the United States. But not only that, with our immigration policies, we also screen people that have substance use disorders, and we screen people that have serious mental illness, and we prevent them from being in our hospitals. We prevent them from coming into our country. And so what happens is we only allow the healthiest of immigrants into the United States. And then we look at that population and we say, oh, there is this healthy immigrant effect. It must be that this particular population makes better choices around their health. They must have different cultural values. And we're not understanding how our own policies are skewing the population that comes into the country. The Social Security Act of 1935 was the act that created retirement benefits. It allowed older adults to be able to work their lives and pay into the system, and then get these retirement benefits when they retired. A great act. The reason that it's an example of structural racism is because in the creation of this policy, Southern senators required that it exclude agricultural and domestic workers. And the agricultural and domestic workers of the South at this time in the 1930s were black people. And so black people were excluded from participation in the Social Security Act. And as a result, you started to see this huge wealth gap that occurred at the start of the Social Security Act that we still see today. A couple of health example. This is data from SAMHSA. It shows that in 2018, 69% of black adults and 67% of Latinx adults with any mental illness received no treatment. 42% of black adults with serious mental illness and 44% of Latinx adults with serious mental illness received no treatment. With substance use disorders, 89% of Latinx adults and 88% of black adults received no treatment whatsoever. And when we stop and think about this, we often say, oh, these populations have greater stigma, these populations minimize their symptoms, these populations aren't interested in accessing care because they have poor insight, but really cost is the main driver for why populations do not seek care, twice as often as minimization of symptoms and nearly 5 times as often as stigma. So again, it is not an intrinsic reason why people aren't accessing these services. It has everything to do with the structural barriers in our society. So in the minute or two that I have left, I'm going to talk about some hopeful solutions. So we're currently in a state of inequality, and that is when we have unequal access to opportunities. And some people think that the goal is equality. Equality is really focused on fairness. It's really saying that we're evenly distributing tools and assistance. So whatever we do for one population, we have to do for the other population. That isn't getting us where we need to go, though. So one of the things we have to focus on is equity. which is making sure that we customize tools to identify and address the inequalities that we see in our society. So equity is one step, but it's not the only thing that we do. We have to combine equity with justice. And justice is when we fix the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. So a couple of ways we can do that I'm going to walk through super quickly. One, we do not learn these concepts in our standard educational practices. And that means it's incumbent on all of us to take extra time to learn these things. And there is an entire body of research and information out there, but it requires us to take that extra time and do that extra work. These are a number of books to get people started, but I also have this example of like how to dip your toe. So if you're not ready to read all of those books, there are a number of important podcasts, there are a number of books that are easier to read, there are documentaries, so there are many, many ways to get this information. We also have to practice cultural humility, and in doing that, we have to start with the first one, which is committing to a lifelong process of self-evaluation and self-critique. And we also have to practice structural competence, which is work from Jonathan Metzl and Helena Hansen, which is the trained ability to discern how a host of issues defined as symptoms, clinical problems, attitudes, or diseases are influenced by upstream social determinants of health. But fundamentally, we have to address the public policies and the social norms that are really driving these issues. And so if we're going to promote social norms of inclusion, equity, and respect, we have to enforce these social norms in all of our settings that we work in our professional and in our personal settings. We have to both educate people, but also legislate, use our laws to prevent people when they are harming and working against our social norms. We have to observe and challenge our own implicit biases, and we have to evaluate and break down unnecessary hierarchies. And we have to advocate for equitable public policies, and that means moving beyond the walls of our clinics and our hospitals and our treatment centers, advocating for those policies that address social determinants of health, communicating with our elected officials, and forming cross-sector collaborations. So I'm just going to end with two concepts. The first, political stances and policy interventions are required, because if we remain apolitical or neutral, that is in fact a political stance. It is a tacit acceptance of the status quo. So we have to take a stand. And so I use these words from Audre Lorde to remind us of that. She said, when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed, but when we are silent, we are still afraid, so it is better to speak. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with is the idea that we have made a lot of progress over these many years. And progress is made through the passage of legislation, court rulings, and other formal mechanisms that aim to promote racial equality. But one thing it's really important for us to understand is with progress always comes retrenchment. And retrenchment refers to the ways in which progress is very often challenged, neutralized, or undermined in key policy arenas. And if we're not prepared for that retrenchment, that inevitable retrenchment in the work that we do, we can get hopeless and overwhelmed. It can lead us to despair. And so I will end with the words of Congressperson John Lewis, who hopefully offered us an antidote to despair when he said, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair, be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." Thank you.
Well, thanks, Dr. Shim, for a really great presentation. We have time for questions, and I see that there are some questions from the floor.
That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I almost don't dare to do this, so feel free to say no. Are you willing to share some of your slides, even if it is just on a PDF, because they are an incredible resource for education for some of our departments, for some of our minority students, for, frankly, people in my lab. Feel free to say no, and that's okay.
No, thank you for that. I'm happy to share my slides, and I freely do so. So
Good.
I'll share them with anybody who would like
Jair
them.
knows me, so.
Okay.
So my last question actually pertains to your last slide. while I fully agree with you that it's better to speak up than to swallow, a string of injustices and sort of the constant radiation that minorities are subjected to, there's a cost to speaking up, and the cost can be quite steep. Do you have any suggestions, and you might not have them, about how to help both institutions, particularly science-producing institutions, to be aware that it's likely that the Black person, the Latino person, the immigrant graduate or undergraduate student will get blamed for things that go wrong, because it's easy to blame them. And because sometimes they don't know how the rules work. And if they speak up, sometimes the hammer comes down on them even worse. So, the nail that comes out of the table gets hammered first. Any suggestions about how to both encourage the resilience of speaking up, but yet making institutions aware that if you do, and individuals aware that if you do, you're gonna get a double dosage of the medicine and the whipping?
Thank you for that. I think those are a really important point of the risk that it takes to speak up. And again, Audre Lorde talks about this in her work, where she talks about how you can be silent and afraid, and you cannot speak, and then you're still in exactly the same place you are. So there is a significant risk, and it still requires that we speak anyway. But one of the things I want to answer your question is to get to, I think, one of the things that's most important about who speaks up. Because with that quote and Audre Lorde telling us to speak up, I think that people of color and people who have been oppressed and marginalized have been speaking up and have been doing that work for a very long time. And so this encouragement about speaking up, it's actually not aimed at the people who have the least amount of power. It's actually aimed at those people, mostly white males, in fact, who have the most amount of power and who oftentimes are witness to terrible things and may feel nervous or uncomfortable about speaking up. And so the idea is that we have to move to a place where those populations start speaking more freely about social norms of equity and inclusion, and start respecting the fact that it's incumbent on them to be doing the speaking. So there is a certain level of responsibility that I think white people have, and people that have power have, to do this work, to do the speaking up. I'm certainly not saying that people in other communities and oppressed and marginalized populations and minoritized populations shouldn't speak up, but they have been speaking up. And so now it's time for the majority of people and the people who have power to look and see these injustices and speak out against them.
Hi, my name is Brianna Davis Reyes. I'm a postdoc at Yale. It was a great talk. My question is a little complicated, so I wrote it down so I wouldn't ramble too much. So I'm going to read it. So I've been thinking about the beginning of your talk about the pervasive stereotype of Black people being lazy. I can't speak for everyone else in the room, but I can speak for myself as a Black woman. I have felt pressure to work double and maybe even triple as hard as my counterparts, and I'm so afraid that as soon as I slip up, all of my credibility and all of the respect I've worked so hard for kind of goes out the window. And when I ask some of my Black mentors for advice, I get the same response, especially from the older generation. And that's just kind of the things are how they are. And I'm afraid that I'll end up like them and give another young Black person that same disheartening advice. They don't mean any harm, and they're giving me advice to help them survive their career. And so I understand where they're coming from.
I'm sorry, I'm having just a little bit of difficulty hearing you. I think it's the echo in the room a little bit.
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah, maybe just speak a little bit slower, just because I think it's just the echo and it's not necessarily you.
Okay, I'll try to.
Oh, that's much better.
Okay,
Yes.
it's the mask, sorry.
Yes, it's the mask.
I don't really want to start over. So basically, the question that I'm asking is that I get advice from Black mentors of mine that pretty much tell you if you want to survive your career, you have to sort of work harder than your counterparts and put your head down and grind it out. And I don't want to end up like that, is what I'm trying to say. I know that they're doing it because they mean well. That's how they survive their career. So my question is, not how do I get other people to think differently of me, but more so, how do I resist spreading the narrative that we are obligated to work harder to get the same recognition and advantages of our counterparts? Was that better?
Yeah, and that's a
Okay.
great question.
Thank you.
It's a great and challenging question. I think that the people who have been successful to this point have had to figure out how to survive in a terribly oppressive system, and they have developed the coping skills that they have needed to use to do that. But to your point, it's not how it should be. What I very much appreciate is that I do feel that there is a new generation coming up in our society and in our scientific spaces that are making it more acceptable for people to be themselves, to be their authentic selves, and that includes being perfect. But no, I mean, allowing for people to have the ability to just to not have so much pressure and expectations placed on them. And I think that, you know, when we have reached a place in our society when we have made true progress, is when people of color and minoritized populations are allowed to be as mediocre as everybody else. But we have not reached that place yet, unfortunately. And so I do think that that is work that we need to do. And I think the only way we change that is that people coming into the field are advocating to make sure that we don't have to work twice as hard. We have to just do enough as everybody else. And I think that work, I'm encouraged because I see even in the medical students that I work with, I see that they're advocating for that. They're advocating for not having a different standard for success for them than for other people. And so I don't know if I have like a specific answer to you other than it's only when you reach a place of power and you have the ability to make policies that are different that you will hopefully value different things, and that's how the system changes. And so I think we have to kind of organize around those things and try to push for a system where we're much more accepting of these things. But I recognize that's not a great answer to your question, which is we just have to fight these things further.
Hi, Lee Hogarth, University of Exeter in the UK. I just wondered where you stood on the distribution of funding between research into the social determinants of mental illness and psychiatry and drug addiction versus biomedical research in the same area. Given that funding's a zero-sum game, is the preponderance of funding for the biomedical an opportunity cost for research in social determinants, and is that funding distribution therefore structurally racist?
If you're going to ask me directly, I'll answer yes. Yes, it is. I think it is. So yes, I think that our funding streams and the way they've been set up have been particularly designed around a white supremacy culture. And in so doing so, and when I say that, there are certain principles of white supremacy culture, like all or nothing kind of ideas, zero-sum game ideas, idea of certain types of research are better than others, that randomized clinical trials are the only way to understand a concept, and that different types of knowledge and different types of acquiring knowledge have less validity. All of those principles, I think, have led to this mismatch and imbalance in what we choose to fund. And so I absolutely think that it is part of the structural racism that exists in our society. And I think that if we were to redistribute that funding, it would lead us to solving, I think, a significant number of the challenges that we spend a lot of time trying to solve in our society today, and yet haven't gotten very far around solving them. So yes, I'm fully in favor of changing the funding streams and focusing more on social determinants research.
Troy Ripke from Rutgers University. I've read many of those books you've already suggested, and you yourself sort of alluded to this, that racism and capitalism go hand in hand, and you have one, you're going to have the other. So in this capitalist society, until there's a revolution, we're still going to have racism. So how can we move forward in this society structure that we have to actually solve or help deal with the racism that we see today? Like, I don't see how we can get rid of either one. Get rid of one if we still have the other, is what my question is.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Because you're talking about structural racism, and it's all based on capitalism. So it's just, yeah.
Yes, it's, and I pause because it's a great question, but it's also infinitely complicated.
I know.
Because
Well,
it is
you can't
not
solve it right now? I'm sorry.
right. Because it is not as if socialist societies don't have racism, right?
No,
like
yeah,
you know, it's not as if. So yes, capitalism is bad and problematic, but there are capitalist societies that do not have the level of racism, the level of structural racism, and the level of inequity in those societies. And there are societies that are not capitalist that still have these challenges. So it's really complicated. And my thought process around like where do we get started and how do we start to try to move things is I really think it's all about power. And so I think we can change the distribution of power and who has power without necessarily toppling capitalism. But, you know, with people who are different people who have power might make decisions to go in a different way. I think that we've definitely, you know, on a smaller scale, we've you know, our healthcare system has been directly tied to capitalism, and it has gotten us extremely, we're not in a good place as a result of that. So the intervention then, maybe we don't have to completely dismantle capitalism in all of society, but maybe in aspects of our society, they need to be dismantled, including the healthcare system.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. I hope you can make your slides available because you distilled some complicated things very nicely. I've been interested in these issues in scientific organizations. I'm Jack Henningfield, by the way. Since the early 1980s, when I sat on a study section with 8 other guys that looked like me and 1 woman, and we tried to evaluate a grant on how to provide methadone treatment to black women in inner city Philadelphia. And I listened and I thought, we don't have a clue. Anyway, ACNP is one of the organizations that I'm in that is working really hard. And I think you can see a lot of the visible efforts. One of the things that we're always trying to figure out is how do we measure progress? And so I know this is a whole day topic, but one clue we got from NIH colleagues was don't just count diversity in different ways that give people more flexibility to express who they are from a sexual, gender, et cetera point of view, but also inclusion, like how welcome do you feel? But you talked about retrenchment versus progress, so I'm going to leave it with a simple question. What's the best way to measure progress? As scientists, we want to know, are we progressing?
Yeah, it's a great question. If you're asking that question like as an organization, what's the best way to determine progress? I think it's actually pretty simple. And I think it's the same answer for a number of whatever system you're in. And it is that the leadership of that organization, that system, whatever, should fully and completely reflect the population that it intends to serve. And so we are not there. And I love your example of your studies section, right? If you're giving money to people to study black women who use methadone, the people in the room who should be making that decision are probably black women who use methadone. And where we've gotten to progress would be that the percentage of people that are making those decisions reflect the population that they're serving. And so that goes the same for this organization. You know, I saw a nice breakdown of the members of the organization in the poster session. The members of ACNP should fully reflect the demographics of the United States, and they do not. So until they do, we will not have reached the progress that we are trying to get to. And again, that's the membership, but then the leadership should also reflect those demographics equally. And that's the point that we're striving towards. We're so far off from that I think that just even moving in that direction, we're getting closer to where we need to be.
Well, thanks, Dr. Shim, for a really great discussion, very inspiring section. Much appreciated. Thank you all for being here.